Welcome to We Are Human Leaders. Today we are tackling a topic that's been on our hearts and minds for a while. It's one that is rather pervasive and impacts us both personally and professionally. Sally, who and what are we talking about today?
So today we're speaking with Michelle Lim, who is Principal Research Fellow at the University of Sydney, Scientific Chair and CEO of Ending Loneliness Together. And that's what we're talking about, ending loneliness. As you alluded to, Alexis, this is really an issue that is front of mind and heart for both of us. And it's such an exciting opportunity to understand not just what loneliness is for us as individuals, but why it's so important that we actively look at it in our workplaces and as a society.
That's right, Sal. So today's conversation, Michelle is going to help us unpack loneliness, both at a very granular level, what it is, why it's important that we're talking about that. And then she's going to leave us with some very practical tips and ideas around how we can actually look to combat this in our workplace as well. So without further ado, this conversation on loneliness is with Michelle Lim. Let's delve in.
So I'm a clinical psychologist by training. And as a student, I was kind of working in a very highly intensive psychological service, actually in public mental health. And as we all know, definitely in Australia, public mental health is a place where we take care of people with, significant health issues who are often very impaired, and to the point that, we were seeing people 2 to 3 times a day, sometimes really just to monitor medication, for example. And what really struck me as a student and a young psychologist working in that area was that despite us seeing people every day, multiple times a day, them living with carers, with other people, the most common complaint that they did have was that they were lonely. Mm-hmm. And that really made me feel helpless, even as a young psychologist, thinking, well, shouldn't I be able to assist this population who is incredibly vulnerable? I thought I was skilled to assist them, but in fact, the services that I was working within really had these boundaries and constraints, which meant that I really could not offer them what they really wanted. And what they did really want is friendship. Wow. And so our care industry and our service industry for mental health really does not account very well for the social needs of the people that we help. And increasingly now we know that social needs are just as important as mental health needs, for example, and physical needs. And we often kind of talk about, these biopsychosocial approaches, but really we just leave the social out of things. So I think a lot of what I do now is really trying to advocate for bringing that social care into systems, into our community, and for us to think about, addressing loneliness more broadly.
Incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that, Michelle. When you say addressing loneliness more broadly, I'd love to unpack that a little bit. What do you mean by that?
Loneliness is traditionally considered a personal matter. It's something that it's your problem. It's a you problem, right? And if you're lonely, there's something wrong with you. It's because perhaps, you're not social enough, or you're strange, or you're a loser. Those are the kind of terms that people assign to you if you say you're lonely. But now we know that actually loneliness itself is not very different to feeling thirsty. In fact, if anything, you're normal to feel lonely. If you're hungry, again, very much an innate need for you to signal to eat. Same with feeling thirsty, and loneliness is your sign to connect. And that's how we actually traditionally thrive as a community, as humans. The way we are designed is to be social. But somewhere along the line, we've decided that loneliness is a thing that we cannot be, and it's a bad thing to be, and that we have to conceal it and we have to hide that feeling. And while it is extremely normal to feel lonely, what's happening is that we have, because of the stigma, we have now become persistently lonely because we don't address it. We don't talk to other people about it. We feel disempowered to actually seek the help that we need. So we need to live in a world that helps us meaningfully connect with others and not just meaningfully, healthily connect with others, because we do know sometimes we are connected to people who might not be good for us. So we need to think about solutions that could help each and everyone live in a world where we can find that meaningful social connection easily.
That's fascinating, Michelle. And can you help us understand how exactly does loneliness differ from things like solitude or isolation?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, because that's actually the crux of why this issue has really been misunderstood for a very long time. So loneliness itself is a subjective feeling. It comes up and you can't really observe it in someone. You have to ask them, because in fact, an example going back to when I was working as a psychologist in the system, when you ask other colleagues of mine, do you think that person could potentially be lonely? They'll often say, oh, they're not lonely. They're living with mom and dad, right? But that really doesn't mean anything. That, and that is actually that what she's really trying to say, or what they're trying to say is they're not socially isolated because they're living with other people, but there's still potential to be lonely. Right? So loneliness is subjective. You just can't tell unless you ask someone. And in fact, we probably have evidence now is that there's so much stigma about being lonely. People also deny being lonely, or they actively conceal it. We do know that. And then that's different from, living alone, something I can see, something that's observable to you and me, the number of interactions we have. Maybe if we are living in a more remote rural area, we see fewer people, that would be considered more social isolation. Or if you're unemployed, so you don't have people around you at work, right? I guess remote working kind of does fall into that as well, in which that you are considered technically more socially isolated. Exactly. And then, of course, you have that other term, solitude. And solitude is often kind of described as actually more of a desired state, that you want to be by yourself, and it brings you peace and you recharge yourself. So loneliness is an undesired state. It's something that it's aversive, it's distressing. We don't want it.
I really love that you've highlighted that it's something that we actually have to ask about in order to determine if another person is actually feeling lonely. And even then they may deny it because they don't want to admit it to themselves. But I think this idea that we have that we can simply see from the outside, well, that person is surrounded by people or they seem very social, but we can't actually ever tell unless we ask, and also perhaps hold some space for them to be able to share it.
That's right.
And I'd love to understand a little bit more about what stops us. What is this stigma that we have around? Where does it come from? And I guess the further question is then how can we overcome it? But is it shame? Because I think often for me it feels like there's inherently some kind of shame associated with acknowledging that I'm lonely.
Yeah, and it boils down back to what we think loneliness is as well, isn't it? And unfortunately, media and social media has really compounded and given us different understandings of what being alone versus lonely is. In our State of the Nation report that we did 2 years ago, for example, we asked around 4,000 Australians about their loneliness, and a lot of them were saying things like 1 in 2 Australians were saying things like they would actually actively conceal their loneliness. So if they actively hide it, they were ashamed, of course, and too embarrassed to talk about it. And it's something, again, it's not that loneliness is a bad thing. If anything, it's really seen as a mechanism to keep us thriving. But because of that shame, because of all our misconceptions about what it is, we're treating it as something that's that we don't want and we need to hide. So I was training as a psychologist 21 years ago. And back then we were talking about depression like it's a made up thing. And this is kind of where we're at with loneliness. Is that now we talk about mental health, in a way that's healthier. There's still some stigma around it, but all workplaces need some sort of mental health policy, right? But loneliness is not really, people don't understand it. People don't really put it on the agenda. But we've got about 20 over years of research now that says this is just as important as your physical health and your mental health.
That's very good.
So the World Health Organization has launched their 3-year commission to this issue. and really trying to reposition this issue not as a soft issue, not just as a personal matter. This is everybody's issue. And if I feel lonely, even in the context of within my family and my friends, it doesn't mean anything about you. It doesn't mean anything about the people that you love and care about. What it means is that we're living in a world that really doesn't cater to our social needs anymore.
We've spoken a little bit about solitude, isolation, and some of the things that loneliness isn't. Can you tell us in a nutshell, how exactly do we define loneliness? Is it the absence of quality connection, or what is it in a nutshell?
It is really an absence of the kinds of connections you want. So if you feel your current relationships actually do not meet your social needs, be it quality, sometimes for young people, quantity. Okay, so for young people, they very much favor more, not always deeper. As we age, we favor deeper relationships. But if you feel they're not quite giving you what you really require, then you are more likely to experience loneliness.
So it's that feeling at the end of the day, perhaps I've interacted with 10 people or family or whatever it is, but something just doesn't feel fulfilling.
That's right.
Perhaps I didn't get a chance to express authentically or something like this.
That's right. You might feel like misunderstood, for example, by others, or you feel like you don't have anyone to turn to or talk to despite being around other people. So you don't feel like you could trust people to have that conversation.
Something that's really interesting for me, Michelle, I think over the years, starting to become more honest with myself about when I'm feeling lonely, and certainly acknowledging that there's some shame that I think sort of kept that at bay. But I've recently moved back to Australia from overseas, and I'm living in a new area, and it's been really interesting to be able to acknowledge to myself when I'm feeling lonely and take action on that, and sort of notice perhaps that reservation that I have about acknowledging it, but overcoming that and taking action as a result, and feeling the desired social connection that you alluded to. And I think it's such a it's a real reframe for me, and I'm really still grappling with, I think, being sort of honest in the moment about it. It often takes some time for me to see then in retrospect that I've actually been lonely for a little while.
Yes.
But I'm curious, sort of as individuals, if when we start to build that, I guess, that awareness and that honesty with ourselves, that we're getting that signal with thirst, hunger, loneliness, when we're feeling lonely, what can we do to perhaps firstly build our skills in becoming aware, and then shift that into taking action to resolve it?
I love that question, because there's quite a few things we can do. And I think the main thing is really to adopt healthy perspectives on relationships. And I think people often kind of want a quick fix, and it usually isn't a quick fix. And we know as psychologists, it's usually, if anything, we always discourage people from those, big actions. What we really want to do is kind of taking little actions that are feasible along the way, so that you're actually taking the time to say hi and having a conversation with someone. You're changing a stranger into an acquaintance. You're not having to make a new best friend right away, right? So, and I don't know about you, but as you get older, it's much more difficult to make friends, and in this world, it's very difficult to find good friends. And it's usually, people don't have time, which is the enemy of, of where we're at, where we're at the moment. But we can bake things into our routine. That means that we protect ourselves from the persistent loneliness. Again, as you say, I think, Sally, it's really good for you to kind of be aware of it, and not be ashamed of it, but then to feel empowered to take action, right? So I want people really by the end of this to go, well, if I'm thirsty, I'm just going to have a drink. If I'm lonely, I'm going to, do what I need to connect. But I'm not going to feel ashamed by doing that, because I'm not ashamed of having a drink. So we need to really destigmatize and really have, my dream is that, I'm going to talk myself out of a job, that we're really talking about, in 10, 20 years, that things are being built into our system where we can easily find the connection that we need.
Mm-hmm. And, interestingly, Sal, your experience of moving recently is one that is quite obvious. You're in a new town where you don't know people yet. I had an interesting experience through COVID and transitioning then to full-time remote work. So I have an office in Sydney, but I work predominantly from a different destination. And I feel now, in retrospect, I can recognize that there were definitely moments where I was lonely, but it didn't seem immediately obvious, because I think the transition was happening for everyone, but also happened slowly. And I wonder, Michelle, can you tell us, are there any sort of less obvious signs that we might be experiencing loneliness. For me, for example, I just started to feel sometimes my mood was a little bit down through the day, and I couldn't quite pinpoint where that might be coming from.
Yeah. I think a lot of the I guess the science behind loneliness is that it is very much driven by the brain, and really the social neuroscience of loneliness has been really well studied for the last 30 years at University of Chicago, for example. They have an awesome team there that looked at the brains of people who are lonely. And what they do note is that people who feel lonely are more hypervigilant to social interactions. They're just more wary. They're really looking out to protect themselves from rejection. And so they might not approach social situations quickly. And now these are kind of more subtle signs.
Yeah.
They might be less cooperative or less pro-social. They might just engage in activities much more lightly. They're not really meaningfully engaging. So those are very subtle signs. Those are, and things like, low mood, again, nobody's going to know unless
they are.
Ask. But definitely social anxiety, again, is another co-occurring symptom that people experience. In fact, when I look at some of the studies that we've done in young people specifically, when we screen someone who might be highly lonely, they are almost 33 to 50% also likely to experience social anxiety disorder. So there's some literature around, is this the same thing? Because it's when you're lonely, you're also more likely to be socially anxious, and you're socially anxious, you're also more likely to be lonely, and they feed into each other. Even if you didn't have a clinical diagnosis of social anxiety disorder, we didn't see in large longitudinal studies that we did in the US, loneliness predicts social anxiety, and social anxiety predicts loneliness back across a 6-month period. And so we do know that the brain of someone who feels lonely becomes much more socially anxious, much more withdrawn, less cooperative. They might actually show signs that are what we call negative affect. So they're less likely to smile, they're less likely to give you eye contact. And of course, when you see someone like that, you're not going to think, let's go to talk.
Yeah.
There's a lot of the language that you've just used, Michelle, that really is about this kind of withdrawal almost like there's an energetic sort of cutoff that people experience in loneliness, and I guess also in social anxiety disorder, where it's almost I don't know if it's a fear, but this unwillingness to be vulnerable, perhaps, or might be just this kind of fear of putting ourselves out there. And I don't want to say necessarily that this is necessarily getting worse, and I'd be curious to hear what the research says about that. But is that something that we can intervene in as individuals? Can we kind of start to work on that for ourselves?
Yeah, and I think that, setting kind of different kinds of expectations is really important. So we shouldn't be thinking about making that new best friend, but also little actions. And people who feel lonely might be scared of rejection, but really if you're doing things that are hard to reject, for example, there's an experimental study, I think it was potentially by Professor Lynn Alden, who looked at acts of kindness, and how that might be, actually, no, that's not Lynn Alden's study, but scrap that. But there are studies that look at the effects of kindness, for example, on loneliness, so, and we do know in people who are socially anxious, traditionally we would do things like exposure therapy, but doing acts of kindness will be comparable to exposure therapy. So that, when people are kind, they're not likely to worry that they're going to get rejected, because it's kind of unlikely or a low chance if you're being kind to someone that you're going to get a negative response. So those sorts of things, and kind of framing your behavior in a way that makes sense to other people can help.
It sounds like almost, social anxiety and loneliness sounds like they could be quite introspective experiences. What I feel like I'm hearing you say, Michelle, is that if we focus our attention outwards on others, on helping others, on perhaps being of service, maybe to one individual, to our neighbor in our community, that helps sort of, for lack of a better term, get out of our own head and actually sort of proactively take some steps to create that.
Yeah, and for people who are not currently feeling distressingly lonely, it is a way of protecting themselves from the onset of persistent loneliness. But I think this is where we go back to the issue of this is everybody's problem. Because the truth is that we might not feel lonely now, but we will at some point. Like, I almost guarantee that.
And also, if the people around us are experiencing loneliness or we don't see it, that impacts us as well, right? As individuals, as families.
And you'll be wondering, why are they withdrawing? Why are they saying no to things? Why are they not meaningfully engaging with us? And again, that concealment factor is happening all the time.
When we think about the workplace, Michelle, I'd love to unpack, like, how can we use work, or is there potential for us to use work as almost a sort of experimental zone where we can take action to combat loneliness? And I guess this is both for the person perhaps who's experiencing loneliness, what they could do in a workplace situation, but also how leaders can think about how we work to ensure that we're doing whatever we can to foster that social connection in our work experiences.
Yeah. And I love how you're bringing back to the workplace, because there's also other related concepts like workplace loneliness that's emerging. And my friend, Associate Professor Sarah Wright, is really well versed in this area. But what we do know about the literature as well is that those relationships at work are important to offer a chance to connect with other people. Though we have to talk about remote working as well as something that is, obviously come up as a trend in the post-COVID world. But I think that workplaces really offer an opportunity for people to make different relationships they otherwise wouldn't within their own community, because work is a place where different kinds of people come together, right? But I do see work as a place that offers a different kind of friendship and also an opportunity to practice your skills as well. Yeah.
And you mentioned a term earlier, Michelle, meaningfulness and fulfillment. Is this coming together in a workplace setting, pursuit of something that feels quite meaningful to us? Does that feel like it'd be a natural way to combat that?
Yes. And that is if two people are obviously holding very similar values or shared mission or purpose. And that's where people have a reason to come together.
Yep.
So I think work does very much offer the opportunity for that connection.
What points or tips might you have for a leader who's perhaps managing a team that's either hybrid, a combination of work from home and work from the office, or solely remote? How can we create connection in those kinds of environments?
Well, first thing to kind of even take a step back is, I guess, the biggest, advice I do have for leaders is that don't assume that just because you take care of mental health, you will take care of loneliness. Okay, so loneliness. Often what people think is that, and especially if they have HR perspective, they think, oh, but I don't have to address loneliness because I've already got a mental health and well-being program. I can tell you as a psychologist, not much is going to be tackled for loneliness in those programs, because I've seen those programs, and I, as a psychologist, I know that I wasn't even trained in understanding what loneliness is, right? To this day, like this is not an issue that is really even taught to our clinicians or our doctors and in the community. So I think it's really to understand that there's actually a space to start to learn about it. Again, it is not, you can have no mental health issue but still feel lonely, right? And if anything, ironically, loneliness has got quite also robust evidence towards things like physical health. So it is just a health and social issue. So to really learn about what it is and what it's not, and then to recognize how your team members might be experiencing loneliness and what that looks like, but also how to address it in a meaningful way, how to address it so that people don't feel disrespected.
Yeah. Can you give an example of what that might look like, to sort of be able to perhaps, if you sense that someone's feeling a little bit lonely, how would you perhaps broach that in a respectful way?
Yeah, I would actually ask what I can do. Yeah, because that really removes the assumption of that you know the answer, because remember, it's subjective, right? So for examples, all of us here sitting at this table, we have very different social needs and different preferences for connecting. If I then go to you and say, oh, you have to do X, and you're like, no, I don't. It feels disrespectful, like, oh, you don't understand me, and that actually would drive that relationship more apart.
Yep.
So if you actually come with the perspective of what is it that I can do to help, and also for the person who's helping not to see it as something about them, because often they're like, well, I'm your friend. Like, why do you feel that way? And that really just puts the attention back on, the person who's helping again. Like it's not helpful. And people who feel that way often say, I don't understand how it became their issue all of a sudden, or I don't understand, why they're asking me to do X. I know it feels like they just disrespected me, or I don't feel like, they're helping.
Yeah. They don't really see me.
Exactly. So I just, and this is, I guess it's almost a 101 psychology skill, right? Is that you just never assume. And what is it that works for you? It's another one, or has worked for you in the past? Is there something that we can do to help you feel more empowered to kind of activate those things again? So, and sometimes this is really sad, but sometimes there are things that, someone might be going through grief or loss, and really sometimes you can't do much about it, and you can just really provide a listening ear, and that's really, maybe that's what they need. So,
and I think sometimes even just someone saying, I'm here for you if you need me, even if you don't act on that, but just that knowledge can also, I think, potentially shift from the level of loneliness that we're experiencing, because you know someone cares.
Yes. But I would also recommend that you act on it. If you do say that,
Sure.
do also provide the listening ear, and I think that people who are lonely are looking for that meaningful, authentic connection. And if it's not authentic, and I think that things that we put in place, for example, in the workplaces, like if it's just seen as something tokenistic, I think people can see through that very quickly. But the simple things and the simple little things that leaders can do to provide space, to provide an activity for people to come together, but not just once off, but this is baked into your routine, into your work culture, that is much more meaningful than like this big event that they throw and, let's all go on team building day and let's do that. And after that, what happens, right? So it's like you get 3 days together, but nothing for the rest of the year. So I think it's really thinking about that team culture and that space and what we can do always in our routine.
Yeah. Now, Michelle, you've mentioned that you feel it's extremely important that we separate the matter of loneliness from mental health, especially in the systemic way we might be organizing our workplaces. Is there one or two tips that you might be able to give leaders in terms of bringing perhaps is it a loneliness policy into the workplace, or what is something we can do in a more systemic way in the workplace?
Yeah, I would think some sort of connection policy.
Okay.
So you reduce loneliness as subjective construct, but also the objective construct where possible. So say if you have also kind of a remote working or hybrid kind of working policy, to see if you can on occasion or regularly bring people together on set days. So don't have people kind of coming in on days and then other people are not around. So really kind of getting people to see each other and have those opportunities for those water cooler talks, like those sorts of organic interactions are just as important. And I think really, I think a lot of awareness around within our employees itself, why we're doing what we're doing, and of course that, there might be a bit of a pushback, I think, these days around like people do want a flexibility, but there's also that balance of that work culture and fostering a positive work culture. And it's so really important to address things like bullying. It's so important. And strong leadership. And you have leadership that's chaotic and toxic. Whatever you do is not going to work. And it's just like it just wouldn't work. And how do we build that positive work culture? And that's sometimes very complicated in some organizations.
Sure. Yeah. I love that you've highlighted that it's, there's a lot around how we lead, who we are as leaders and how we lead that can really be determinative for culture, including the impact on potentially mitigating loneliness. And I imagine there's also a role for leaders to be role models as well, to be talking about issues like loneliness or feeling, or healthy forms of solitude that we experience, having conversations around what our needs are. So also to sort of highlight, well, we all have different needs. Are they being met? And to sort of create space for, I think, those conversations could be important.
And it's really important. I can't stress this enough because I've heard of many examples where leaders want to do that and they want to show good examples, but they themselves have other things that they need to address. All right. So, and the employees can see, oh, that person's, trying hard to foster, this connection. But, on the other hand, this person, they know that the leader's bullying someone else. So it's just whatever they're doing just doesn't have any value.
Yeah.
It doesn't actually reach really effectively what that person wants to do. So really, the leader needs to be addressing whatever they might be going through as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's such an important point, Michelle, this kind of congruence between what we say we want to do in the workplace and the sort of culture we want to live and lead, and then what actually happens. So I think that's such an important point to really, it seems pretty obvious.
Seems obvious, but it's not often.
It's not obvious.
And you'll be very surprised. I get a lot of people come to me to talk about these sorts of things, and that happens in the workplace pretty, quite often.
Yeah. Now, we could talk about loneliness for many more hours. I think, Michelle, I would, really enjoyed unpacking with you, particularly I think in the context of work, that there really is a lot of scope for us as leaders, as individuals, to broach this issue which really pervades our entire society through our work as well, and seeing work as a potential conduit for social connection. Just as a final thought for our listeners, what would you like people to sort of know about loneliness?
Yeah, I think it's really to understand it and to learn it, and make sure that we know that this is not just a you issue, it's an us issue. And I'm not just saying even just us as individuals, it's a community issue, it's a societal issue. And learn about it. And we do run Loneliness Awareness Week because people don't understand it, and just starting to get the language, and we do know the level of where Australians are at, and we do know where we need to be and how we need to educate and improve our awareness around that. So I think understanding what it is, what it's not, understanding how to help others or yourself, or what you can do within our workplaces, in our schools, in our health systems, kind of start reading more widely about it and understand it. And, we do have lots of resources there as well, as if people do want to access them, but it's something that is an issue that we can't really ignore anymore. I think this is an issue that is very highly prevalent, especially in young people. And it's something that cannot be easily rectified, because it is not just simply getting to know more people. That's not really the solution. We really need a much more systems, holistic solution for this.
Thank you, Michelle. And an important call to action to end our conversation today, that loneliness is something we all need to come together to help resolve. So thank you, Michelle, for being with us on We Are Human Leaders. It's a pleasure to sit down with you today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us today at We Are Human Leaders. Alexis, this has been an incredible conversation for me, for really deeply understanding that we can't just see if someone is lonely. I think for me that was the big takeaway, that we really need to go that step further and ask, be curious, and be a little bit vulnerable ourselves in order to break down this huge issue for us as a society right now. What was your biggest takeaway?
Oh, that was a big one for me as well. But also I think on a more sort of systemic level within our organizations, how we can look to separate issues like mental health from loneliness, and helping us get a little more granular around what that means so we can actually tackle it in a more practical way. So if you've enjoyed this episode and you would like to learn more about Michelle Lim and her work on loneliness, check out our show notes at www.wearehumanleaders.com. And if you'd like to learn more about human leadership, you can head to the same link and find all the information about us there. So thank you for being with us on this episode of We Are Human Leaders. It's been a pleasure to have you here with us.
See you again soon.